Sitting in on the meeting between Miller, Kazan, and Harry Cohn was an unknown actress, someone Miller and Kazan had met on the Fox lot after their failed pitch to Zanuck. She'd been tagging along ever since. Marilyn Monroe in 1951 was nobody in Hollywood. She'd had small parts in The Asphalt Jungle and All About Eve, but she was struggling. Her agent and protector, Johnny Hyde, had just died, and Marilyn, never particularly stable, was feeling vulnerable.
When Kazan and Miller first meet her, Marilyn Monroe is not the figure that we think of, the world famous, the icon. She is still a young Hollywood blonde trying to make it. She's notorious already for being beautiful and available. I mean, she is somebody who was passed around a lot.
Within a few days of their meeting, Elia Kazan and Marilyn Monroe began an affair. For Marilyn, the calculation was simple. Kazan was the director of the moment. He had the most to offer her fledgling career. Kazan's affair with Monroe was not out of character for the director. Sure, he was married, had been most of his adult life. But this man, who considered himself short and ugly, had countless numbers of affairs. For Kazan, Marilyn was nothing special. He never even considered her for a part in one of his plays or movies. Arthur Miller was a different matter. A few weeks after meeting Marilyn on the Fox lot, a party was thrown in Arthur Miller's honor. He had won a Pulitzer Prize, and awards like that impressed Hollywood. The host had no doubt who Marilyn would escort to the party. She was marked on the guest list simply as Kazan Girl. But on the night of the party, Kazan backed out. He had a date with another woman. He asked Miller to accompany Marilyn instead.
I don't think Kazan thought she was a great actress. I think he thought she was a great play. Miller, I think, finds a quite different person. And it's a measure of the difference between Kazan and Miller that, God save him, Miller sees something like the spirit of lost America, and he has to rescue her.
When Kazan arrived at the party, he found Miller and Monroe dancing together, Monroe radiant under Miller's attention. All her doubts of self-worth were swept away by this tall, Lincoln-esque playwright. Miller told Monroe how terribly unhappy he was at home, how his wife Mary was cold, distant. But Elia Kazan's morality was not Arthur Miller's. His marriage meant Marilyn was off limits.
In some ways, Miller and his wife Mary were much closer together when he was a failure than they were when he was a success. He was entering a new world. It was a world of the theatre, of actors, actresses, directors, all the things she didn't share. So the strain was going to be there, I think. And the estrangement began to build. Not that Miller meant to do anything about it. He was a family man. He was determined to try to make it work, as up to a point was she. But I think by the time that Miller took off to Hollywood with Kazan, the strain was more than evident.
Arthur Miller was thrown by Marilyn Monroe. Afraid he might fall to temptation, he fled Hollywood for his home in Brooklyn Heights. Once there, he vacillated between self-satisfied praise at remaining faithful and wondering why he had ever left Monroe. Kazan stayed behind. He had to put the finishing touches on his film version of Streetcar. And even though Monroe now professed her love for Miller, Kazan continued to sleep with her. It was, even by Hollywood standards, an odd threesome. In her bedroom next to her bed, Monroe kept a picture of Miller and signed copies of his plays. After she and Kazan made love, they would stare at Miller's picture and talk lovingly into the night about the playwright. By the time A Streetcar Named Desire opened, it had been almost a year since the hook had fallen victim to Harry Cohn's red baiting. A year since Marilyn Monroe had fallen for Arthur Miller, even while continuing her affair with Kazan. For a time, she and Miller corresponded, but Miller, determined to make his marriage work, soon broke it off. Kazan also met with Spyro Skouras, the president of 20th Century Fox. If Zanuck had been circumspect, Skouras was blunt. He told Kazan that if he continued to defy the committee, his career in pictures would be over. Seeking solace, Kazan called Marilyn Monroe. The two had not spoken in almost a year, and in that time Marilyn had blossomed into a full-fledged star. Kazan invited her to his hotel, but Marilyn said no. She had a date, she said. She'd come by later. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Marilyn let herself into Kazan's room, got into his bed, and announced she was engaged to Joe DiMaggio. "He's not like these movie people," Marilyn gushed. "He's dignified." Kazan congratulated her, and then the two made love. When Arthur Miller returned from Hollywood, he began to work on a new play he called The Conversation of Men. In it, a man named Quentin, trapped in a cold, sexless marriage, thinks of cheating on his wife. He longs for a reason to stay faithful, but finds none, other than her demands for fidelity. But after his walk in the woods with Kazan, Miller abandoned that idea and instead drove to Salem, Massachusetts. There, sifting through the court records of the witch trials from 1692, he hoped to find a way to make sense of the hysteria that had claimed his friend. In 17th century Salem, Arthur Miller believed he'd found the perfect metaphor for the witch hunts of the McCarthy era. In both, reason gave way to hysteria, and all moral weight was ceded to the accuser. But Miller was also tortured by what he saw as his own moral failings. His marriage no longer fulfilled him, and he wrestled with his desires outside it. In the margins of his notebook, Miller wrote of his inability to speak and think with the same voice, to align his heart with his ethics. This, consciously or not, became the private drama at the center of the crucible. In Salem, Miller had discovered his protagonist amid the court records. John Proctor had been a tavern keeper, a man in his 60s and a victim of the witch hunt. Miller reimagined him as a man in his mid-30s who suffers a cold, distant marriage and is tortured by an affair he has had with a younger woman.
The strength of the play derives from the dynamics between John Proctor and his wife Elizabeth Proctor and John Proctor's former mistress, Abigail Williams. Miller creates a character who's a flawed human being because Miller sees himself as a flawed human being. And what he's doing is showing an individual who attempts to come to terms with his humanity.
Woman, I'll not have your suspicion anymore.
I have no...
I'll not have it.
Then let you not earn it.
John Proctor was full of guilt. His wife knew what was going on, Elizabeth Proctor, and had turned Abigail out of the house. She was their servant and had gotten rid of her, but then she also had rejected John herself and would not sleep with him.
You will not judge me more, Elizabeth. I have good reason to think before I charge fraud on Abigail, and I will think on it. Let you look to your own improvement before you go to judge your husband anymore. I have forgot Abigail
And I.
Spare me! You forget nothing. Learn charity, woman. I have gone tiptoe in this house. All 7 months she is gone. I have not moved from there to there without, I think, to please you. And still an everlasting funeral marches round your heart. I cannot speak, but I am doubted, every moment judged for lies, as though I come into a court when I come into this house.
John, you are not open with me. You saw her with a crowd, you said. Now you...
I'll plead my honesty no more, Elizabeth.
John, I am only...
No more! I should have roared you down when first you told me your suspicion, but I wilted, and like a Christian I confessed. Confessed! Some dream I had must have mistaken you for God that day, but you're not, and let you remember it. Let you look sometimes for the goodness in me, and judge me not.
I do not judge you. The magistrate sits in your heart that judges you. I never thought you but a good man, John. Only somewhat bewildered.